This is the Knowledge Graph Insights podcast, episode number 28. Every modern enterprise wrestles with the scale, the complexity, and the urgency of understanding their data and metadata. So, by necessity, comprehensive architectural approaches like microservices and the data mesh are complex, big, and fast. Ole Olesen-Bagneux proposes a simple, small, and slow way for enterprises to cultivate a shared understanding of their enterprise knowledge, a decentralized approach to metadata strategy that he calls the metagrid.
Welcome to the Knowledge Graph Insights podcast, where experts on knowledge graphs and the semantic web share their wisdom with the digital and business communities. Our mission is to demystify and democratize knowledge graph technology and practices to make the benefits of knowledge graphs and semantic technology accessible to all. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 28 of the Knowledge Graph Insights podcast. I am really delighted today to welcome to the show Ole Olesen-Bagneux. Ole is he's currently the chief evangelist at Actian. Welcome, Ole. Tell the folks a little bit more about your role at Actian and what you do there.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you for having me on. This is a great topic that we will dive into today. And first of all, I recently joined Actian. So it's been my first week since we recorded this. I am the chief evangelist in Actian, so I will be telling the story of Actian as this technology evolves. Actian is a data platform. It's based in the US and it is part of the HCL software family. So Actian is a data platform, and as this data platform changes and evolves over time, I'll be telling that story. That's really what I'll be doing.
What a fun job, evangelizing a technology platform. I love that kind of work. And you're also working on a book called
Yes.
Fundamentals of Metadata Management, which is all about the metagrid concept that you came up with. And that's what I really want to talk about today. How's the book going? It's due for publication this year, correct?
That is correct. I finalized the first draft version of the manuscript a couple of weeks ago, and I am very confident that I will publish it on time, maybe a little earlier than the current publication date. That I don't know, but it's coming along nicely. It's been a difficult book to write. It's kind of the sum of my experience as a leader and an enterprise architect, working closely with like all things data for the last 10 years.
Nice. Sort of a encapsulation. Well, it's an intriguing idea. And I love we were talking before we went on the air about how much I love a good framework. Is that the right way to think about it? Like, I guess, how would you define the metagrid?
So the metagrid, as I see it, is first and foremost an integration architecture between distinct types of technologies that do not perform the the value chain of a company, such as ERP systems and CRM systems and what have you. Neither is it focused at the analytical plane, so to say, the data mesh universe, where you're trying to discuss how centralized or decentralized should your analytical data technologies be, like data warehouses, data lakes, and the like. The metagrid really is about these small technologies that depict the IT landscape: the information security management system, the data catalog, the endpoint management system, the knowledge management system, all these systems that for distinct purposes depict the IT landscape. So a short definition of the metagrid is that it is an integration architecture that connects metadata across metadata repositories.
Nice. That connects across repositories. And that's one of the key things about the metagrid, is that your conception of metadata differs. Well, you come out of a library science background, isn't that right? And
That's right.
And I've kind of learned most of what I know about metadata from like my librarian friends. But I've also I think I've fallen into not trap, or like a different way of thinking about it than you do. This notion of just thinking about the kinds of metadata: descriptive metadata, administrative, technical, all that, those kinds. And you have a different take on metadata. I'd love to hear how you think of it.
You bet. Yes. Well, first of all, let me emphasize that I don't think the way you think of metadata is wrong. It's quite important for me. But what I see lacking in that kind of thinking, for example, in the data management book of knowledge, the Dharma book, or other resources, vital resources in this field, right, is that if you do that subcategorization of metadata into operational, technical, business, social, what have you, then you kind of discuss subcategories instead of the actual nature of metadata. And what I've come to find in my work life is that this kind of perspective gives you some blind spots to something that is very, very important in metadata. So how I define metadata is not in terms of its subcategories. I don't think you can do that actually for metadata. I try to find the very nature of metadata in my definition of it, and that is that it is not anything in particular, but that it is always in two places at once. That's the key to metadata. It will be in a repository and it will be at source. Just like a book has its information, its metadata in the book itself and on Amazon. Just like the data in a data catalog is listed in the data catalog and in the data sources of that particularly data source that you've scanned. So metadata is in two places at once. And that definition unfolds the idea of the metagrid, because once you have established this definition, you can also look at this definition as a problem, because what it creates, and you can see that at every single company in the world, is that you have a lot of different metadata repositories listing the same type of metadata. And that's the problem that the metagrid addresses, that all these small activities in all these small teams are taking place in isolation.
Mm-hmm. Is that the classic silo issue in enterprise architectures?
It's definitely the classic silo issue in enterprise architecture, just for a very distinct purpose. And so I feel very, very connected to everything team topologies, everything data mesh, microservices, like these ideas of thinking of how to break up monolithic thinking and monolithic technology practices is something that is very, very close to my heart and my mind.
Yeah, that and that close to mine as well. I help organize a conference called Decoupled Days. It's all about microservices and decoupled architectures. But I love that you. But one of your, I read a bunch of stuff preparing for this. But you did this one blog post where you had a table that compares like the microservices architectures, the data mesh, and your meta grid, and it kind of gets like increasingly simple as you go from side to side. It seems like. But can you? And you just added another one, the team topology to this. Can you? And to me, that was a helpful way for me to understand the metagrid, was by contrasting it with those other models. Can you talk a little bit about each of those?
Yeah, sure. That could be a long talk, but I'll try to be. I'll try to be short.
I'll start a timer for you.
Yeah, but so basically, I think microservices ties closely to operational data in a company. So what you can do is you can take all the big monoliths of the value chain in a company, like I just mentioned, the ERP systems, the CRM systems, and the like, and you can break them up into tiny services that functions like in a decoupled way. This architecture is extremely complicated to achieve. Like it's very, very complicated to achieve a microservice architecture. But if you do it, your company will have a competitive advantage that is remarkable. I'm sure you know all this, but this is for your listeners to explain. So a microservice architecture is basically very, very complicated. It's big, it's fast, and it's complicated. The same goes for data mesh. The data mesh architecture won't be as big and as complicated as a microservice architecture, but it will still be relatively big, relatively complicated, and fast. A data mesh architecture is an architecture that does not look at the operational data in a company. It does not look at the value chain of a company, but it looks at the analytical plane. It looks at the data warehouses, the data lakes, the data lake houses of a company, and breaks the content of these quote unquote monoliths up to small data products. And that's a data mesh. It's relatively complicated to achieve a data mesh, and depending on your definitions, no company in the world has achieved it, or a lot of companies has achieved it, depending a little bit of how much of a theoretical purist you are in terms of what a data mesh is. And then what I suggest is a metagrid that is a decentralization also, but it's a conceptual, an intellectual decentralization. So it's not a technical decentralization as such. I am not arguing the end of specific metadata repositories, but what I'm seeing is that you need to do the same thing for metadata as we have done in the past for analytical data and for operational data. And I've seen this very concretely because I know that a lot of teams are working on the exact same type of metadata in their teams with their technologies. So I know this is a fact, and I have readers from all over the world, from all kinds of companies of a certain size. You need to have a certain size and a certain age before this becomes a problem in a company. But I have a lot of readers from all over the world reaching out and explaining that finally someone that gets this, finally someone that explains it. But basically, the metagrid does the same thing as microservices, a data mesh, but for metadata in metadata repositories. And it's a relatively small architecture. It's a relatively simple architecture, and it's a slow architecture. So it's not complicated technically to achieve this. What is complicated is the very realization of this. It's complicated to address in a company because these really are silos. These are not teams that have been used to working together. But the big promise of the metagrid is that you can really achieve something. You can achieve an enormous solidity in your IT, in your understanding of your IT landscape if you get this. And so I think to be honest, I think I address a problem in IT and tech and data that is hard to identify and hard to grasp. But once you get that, it's relatively easy to solve. And there's not that many problems that are easy to solve in data and tech. But I actually think this is not that difficult once you get it.
Yeah, and that simplicity, that really resonates with me as you do that. One of the things you were just talking about is you were talking right now, you mentioned IT a lot, but you talk about the 4 domains of the metagrid. It's not just IT, it's data, information, and knowledge as well. As you were just talking right now, I'm wondering like, okay, how do you, well, I guess first, I'm curious about how you operationalize this, like what it'll look like on an ongoing basis. But I first think you kind of have to build it. Are you just capturing like, documentation of metadata repos around an enterprise? And is it as simple as like in sales they do it this way, in marketing they do it this way, or is it something like that? Or what's the how do you build a metagrid, I guess?
So I would actually argue that a metagrid is not something you build. I argue, and I can prove, that metagrid architectures, once we accept the term metagrid, they exist in every single company already. So every single company will have a configuration management database. If it's an old company that's done a lot of mergers and acquisitions, they will have multiple configuration management databases. And in those systems, you will have lists of IT systems, you will have lists of integrations, of application owners, and what have you. Now, many companies also have business process mapping systems, for example. And in those two systems, processes in the company is listed as a metadata example, a metadata type. These processes are rarely aligned because a business process mapping system is something that is used either for quality cases or for financial auditing cases. But it lists business processes. And the CMDB, for example, I mean, I think I discussed 17 types of metadata repositories in my book, but these two would perhaps have like business processes that would overlap. That would also overlap with the information security management system maintained by a chief information security officer or a data privacy officer using a registry to list how sensitive data is processed. So they will also work with the processes. And so these things, or these metadata types, they interact across repositories. Now, processes it's just one example. You have a lot of different examples. Applications, type of endpoints, like you can have very technical, concrete examples, such as servers and server names. But you can also have very abstract elements, such as processes or project names and stuff like that, product names. So that's the architecture that I argue. If you get that context under control across these repositories, then you save a lot of time and you get a lot more solid metadata architecture across these tools.
Yeah, and so as you describe that, it's really not just, but it's mostly a discovery. And is it like a documentation process, just kind of going out and discover?
So yes, I would argue that it is a. So what I argue that the metagrid is it's documents, it's diagrams or pictures, and it's data, examples of data or entire data sets. And then obviously what the metagrid architecture suggests is that you create integrations between these systems so that each team does not do this in isolation, and more importantly, does not do this repetitively, because that's the big issue with this architecture. It's that these teams have listed these things independently of each other to perform their business tasks, their particular goals. And then obviously you can, once you've established this very, very basic architecture, this very simple architecture of API calls and architecture decision records and spreadsheets and diagrams, once you've achieved that, you can of course consider more complicated architectures using, for example, ETL, ELT tooling to perform this in a more automated way. And obviously also, and I've seen this, that's why I was persuaded that it can be done. I've seen this by readers that have reached out to me. 2 times I've seen it, but I won't mention these, obviously. But you can use, like, on top of all this, if you want, and if you have a lot of organizational buy-in, you can use knowledge graphs to perform the metagrid. But yeah.
No, I was going to ask, because this is the Knowledge Graph Insights podcast, and it's like everybody in this world knows about you and your work and talks about it all the time, but you never explicitly talk about knowledge graphs. So that I wanted to stitch that in a little bit. So a knowledge graph might be one way to implement this knowledge that you discover is that a correct way of thinking about it, or?
Yes, I believe it is. The reservations I have is that I want to create something that is easily addressable and easily solvable with the metagrid. And I'm not sure you would need a graph to perform a metagrid architecture, but obviously if you want to perform it at scale, if you want to build a custom user interface to explore the metagrid, then it would be super nice with a graph, wouldn't it? But the reservations I have come from practical experience. I do not want to build a North Star. I think of data mesh architecture, microservice architectures as North Star architectures that are beautiful and like extremely elegant in the way they have been proposed by Martin Fowler and Sam Newman, and obviously also Jean-Marc Degani. I think of those persons as brilliant technologists. The metagrid architecture is a solution that should work out of the box today for people fighting with metadata management out there in companies, like I have done myself. I have a lot of practical industry experience, and I am very humble in terms of what you can actually do in a company to change this agenda. So instead of describing only the North Star, what I have set out to do is to describe the practical reality that you can change right now. But obviously, moving towards the North Star is possible if you get a lot of organizational buy-in. But what I know, what I've seen, and what I've heard is that regardless of what type of metadata repository you're talking about, implementations of these technologies are typically very, very poor. They are not working that well. I have a lot of my first book, The Enterprise Data Catalog, gave me a lot of readers confessing to me, like an enormous amount of readers from all over the world, confessing to me that they thought my book was brilliant, but that they had not succeeded in implementing a data catalog in their organization for a lot of reasons that are linked to politics, time, technical understanding, mandate, and so forth. So I don't want to create an architecture that is only doable if you have all these things in place, because I've seen it go wrong so many times. And also because what the Metagrid architecture really is, like the core of the Metagrid architecture, is a way out of that labyrinth. If you have implemented an information security management system and you have not succeeded that well in it, the Metagrid architecture is there to help you, because it can make you connect dots that you didn't know of before in tools that you don't know exist inside your company, managed by teams that you have never spoken to. And so actually I can help you succeed with that technology with the Metagrid, and I can do that for all kinds of teams looking in all kinds of new directions. That's what I want to do with the Metagrid architecture. And obviously, if you get really on top of things, if you are a brilliant technologist, yes, then you can actually power the Metagrid with a graph. I've seen that, and that is fantastic. Like, it's moving.
No, you recently posted on LinkedIn about that you weren't thinking of this, that you hadn't thought of this as a knowledge graph thing, and you thought, wait a minute, a couple of people have done this. Did I read that correctly?
You did read that correctly, but there is a bit more to that story, because I actually wanted to start the book like that, as like when I writing of this book or proposed the book to Aurelie, I actually wanted it to be a knowledge graph book. But then I got a lot of like feedback saying, a lot of people were like, and so I kind of like I chewed down that level of that perspective a little bit, but like with the massive, and I must say it's been quite massive, the interest that have been like that this concept has created, and so I've had a lot of people from all over the world reach out to me, and I have seen, but I must say these are very, very skilled persons in companies that obviously have a lot of money, but a lot of companies have a lot of money, but they have managed to obtain and maintain a position inside these companies where they are capable of successfully working with knowledge graphs distinctly for this purpose. And that, I must say, is very impressive. Very impressive and super beautiful if you see that, like navigating the reality of the IT landscape from very, very, very high level conceptual descriptions into like the fiber cables going from one office to another, and like where our data center sits in the world, and where our applications are linked, and what kind of sensitive data they contain, and like see all these strategic, always, or in the most cases, these strategic players that have so little knowledge about what is going on in the company, even though they have this quite substantial responsibility. Like, for example, if a data privacy officer does not understand or answers incorrectly to authorities about these things, you know how the severity of fines and even lawsuits that will be personally addressed to this person, right? It's super, super important. And so seeing that is beautiful. But I argue that you don't need to reach that North Star to make this work and get going. What you need to understand is that there is a set of technologies mapping the IT landscape for different purposes, leveraging different capabilities, but something that is very fruitful, very useful for you that you don't perhaps know about.
Mhm. And you've talked about, I'm getting like the three things you mentioned earlier about this is small, simple, and slow. I got to admit, I'm not getting my head around the slow part of it. How is it? I kind of, I think I get it, but I'd love to hear you elaborate on that a bit.
Yeah, sure. I think it's way more simple than you think, but it's just, if you want to build a microservice architecture, it needs to be fast. It needs to be fast because it needs to be very responsive. You cannot have an ERP system that does not perform, I won't say in real time, but fast. You need it to be fast, right? Because if it's not fast, then you can't respond to changes in the market fast. And you can't, it's simply, it doesn't work. You need operational data to be responsive fast in certain cases. So a microservice architecture, the entire intention of it is to decouple, to be flexible, to be adaptable. And if that is something that you have to perform with like 1 week latency, then what's the point, right? The same goes for data mesh. If you want real-time analytics to change like the constitution of your or the structure of your website, or like how a car moves, or how some kind of tool for gardening responds to your movements, or I don't know, like any IoT device, or like you would need real-time analytics, you would need fast analytical data to be able to get a refined usage of a data mesh architecture. But the metagrid really is in no need of speed. And I may be, there may be readers reaching out to me saying you're not right on this one, but typically a metadata repository responds to regulative, innovative, or operational needs that are not urgent in the present. It's solidity over time that is important. So your business process management system may need data from a CMDB, the example I mentioned earlier, or vice versa. But if you do a synchronization once a week, it will work. There's no it will work. So when I'm saying it's simple, it's because it's important not to build a complicated architecture, a complicated technology setup. I mean, obviously you could stream a data mesh, but do you really want to do that? Or a metagrid, but do you really want to do that? It's not that important in this case. And what happens typically if you try to do that is that you get a technological setup that is so difficult to build that you will not achieve the goal you have. And it's the goal you want to reach, and the goal is not difficult to reach. So don't give yourself that obstacle.
Yeah, that's something that comes through in all the things I've read, and I can't wait to read the book now because it's clear that all those things. And also something, as you were talking just now, are you familiar with Stuart Brand's PACE layers model?
I gotta admit, I'm not.
I'll share it with you, and I'll put a copy of it in the show notes, because as you were just talking, now I get it. The slower, because it's sort of, he has two metaphors that he uses to describe like the capability for change within systems. And it's sort of like, one of them is like a geologic metaphor, like layers of crust going down into the earth. And as you were just talking, it's like metagrid is just an understanding of the deep, like structural governance-y kind of layers, just an understanding of them, not the details of them. And so that's a deeper layer in what his is. And then the further out you get in that model, the more like there's the need for like real-time ERP, data. Yeah, that's just an enterprise requirement. And but that's a different concern than understanding the whole architecture. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. It makes sense. I mean, what really the book that made this crystal clear for me is Data Management at Scale by Pete Stringholt. It's an O'Reilly author. Also, I read his book as an enterprise architect, and it really was like an epiphany for me because it's a very pragmatic book that suggests that the nature of your use case defines how you manage and move data. So obviously it's a book. It has a big chapter on batch. It has a big chapter on APIs. It has a big chapter on stream or real time or whatever you want to call that. And I like the pragmatics of this book. Obviously, we can all agree that all data, everything data should be streamed in every single use case. But that's like an ideal. The reality is different, and so knowing when to use what kind of stack or tech setup or just integration patterns is really what this is about. If you have limited economic means and limited full-time employees, and also limited attention span by executive leadership, right? So knowing what to do when in this universe is really important. But there are many books on this topic, obviously, also fundamentals of data engineering. Like there's an immense set of books that describes this way of thinking. But that book definitely sounds cool as well. I like the idea of layers. So joy.
I think it's germane. I think you'll appreciate it. But I can't believe it, Ole. We're already coming up close to time, and I could literally talk about this forever. But I feel like we've given folks a good taste of the book, and like I said, I can't wait to see it. But before we wrap up, is there anything you want to revisit from the conversation, or just want to make sure you share before we wrap up?
I think there's a detail around team topologies that I recently published on my Substack. I have a team structure that I call the data discovery team that I suggest build this. I just want to make sure everyone also get that detail from the conversation. The data discovery team would consist of a member from each of the metadata repository teams that I mentioned in the book, and they would kind of collaborate to create the metagrid. In its simplest, actually, team topologies use the term thinnest viable platform. I love that term. It's exactly what the metagrid is. It's the thinnest viable platform. So it's documentation, architecture decision records, it's diagrams, pictures of the architecture that you're building, and then it's data sets or entire data sets. And then obviously you can set up all kinds of integration architectures on top of that. But I just wanted to make sure that like the data discovery team and the metagrid is a team topology that can make this work. It's not something that is difficult to obtain.
Nice. I love that. And the notion of team topologies, I'll link to some, I did some research about that before we talked, and I'll link to some resources about that. But I also love the thinnest viable platform. That seems like something that every enterprise should be aspiring to.
Shouldn't it be? Like, it's a brilliant concept. I love it.
Yeah, that's great. Well, hey, one very last thing, Ole. If folks want to connect with you or follow you online, what's the best place to find you?
The best place to find me would be LinkedIn. You can find me at Ole Olesen-Bagneux on LinkedIn. I also have a Substack that I publish on in-depth on the Metagrid, so you can find me there. My name is also Ole Olesen-Bagneux. I have a publication called the Metagrid Notes on Substack, and then I'm also on Medium. It's also just my name.
Excellent. I'll link to all those in the show notes as well. Well, thank you so much. My mind is blown into the best possible way. So thanks so much, Ole.
Thank you for having me on. It was a pleasure.
For show notes and to sign up for our newsletter, visit our website at knowledgegraphinsights.com. And please rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you for listening.